I think all of you hopefully know me, Steve Druggan. My honor to be your head of school. And joined with me today is Will Dunbar, who is a parent of three boys and the head of the Diversity Resource Network and the Parent Association. And Will was responsible for helping organize Cory Booker's talk this evening. As you know, we've moved Cory to February as he has some other things going on in the government this week. And so we were able to quickly pivot to an incredible bullpen. We are joined tonight by Marshall Mitchell and Attorney General Josh Shapiro. This will be the first time I've actually met Josh, but I'll start with Marshall. Marshall and I think, actually met for the first time 3 or 4 years ago. Will made the introduction, and Marshall came over to walk the campus with me and get the best BLT in Philadelphia. For those of you who have kids who are at school, when Teresa was there, and Marshall, don't you agree that it was as good a BLT as it gets?
Beyond the shadow of a doubt.
And Marshall, we had wonderful conversations when he visited that time, and continue those conversations up. And Marshall's also helped steer some students our way. Thank you for that, Marshall. And it's just been great for me as a non-Philadelphian to really have people like Marshall and Will to help me understand Philadelphia and help me work through help SCH work through times we're in. Josh, I don't know you as well, but Josh, I think, is more famous in many ways. He's our Attorney General for
Marshall's little brother.
Marshall's little brother.
I've got him by 6 months. Do not let him go through this charade. He's 50, just like I am now.
And Josh, I believe you were born in Kansas and then ended up in Montgomery County, and then gone on to Georgetown and then back to Philadelphia or Montgomery County, and now the Attorney General for the state of Pennsylvania. And Marshall and Josh are with us tonight on Dr. King, on the day that our country honors Dr. King. And as I wrote to my faculty on Friday, this is, I believe, a really important time for all of us to be rereading our history, making sure that we, the only owner's manual we're given really is history. And the history of people like Dr. King and Abraham Lincoln, who Marshall and I were discussing earlier, are so important as we continue to build the best democracy. And as we know, democracy is the only alternative. What is it? The quote is something, everything, the worst form of government except everything else. And so tonight we're going to continue learning more about Dr. King's legacy and how that can help guide us forward. And so thank you, SCH, for coming out tonight. Thank you, Marshall and Josh, for joining us. Will, thank you for making this happen. If we have time for questions at the end, you'll be putting those into the chat, and Will Dunbar will facilitate those. And then back in February, we'll all join together again with Cory Booker. Marshall, thank you. Josh, thank you. And over to you, Marshall.
Thanks so much, Steve and Will and Leslie and others. And Josh, always good to see you. Josh, we've gotten accustomed to looking at your bookshelves over the last 9 years. So I got to figure out what you're reading. One of the things that I know you're reading well is history. And you're reading these times as well as anybody else I talk to or see on television. Where do you think we are? And I guess I should preface everything I say by Josh is one of my closest friends on the planet. We talk about everything from our faith, our family lives, racial issues, issues of justice, sports, kids, everything. You're reading, you're seeing history in real time. Where do you think we are as a country for the students at SCH and faculty who are wondering and trying to figure out a flashlight to help them get through these times?
Yeah. Well, first off, Marshall, thanks for being here. And everything Marshall says is true. We are dear friends outside of the public roles that we have. And I don't make too many moves in life without checking in with Marshall. I tell my wife I'm checking in with her too, but I check in with Marshall and he guides me and steers me in a terrific way. And by the way, when I talk to Cory, I'll let him know that you and I were pinch hitters for him. And I'm sure y'all are in for a real treat, next month when he shows up. Look, I think we're at a really dangerous time, Marshall. And, one of the things about a lot of these books on the shelf behind me is they contain facts, right? They're books about history. They're books that contain facts. And at SCH, you learn a lot of facts. And I would suggest that after you learn those facts, you have vigorous debates. And there are people, that view things one way and view things the other. But, embedded in those debates are a basic common set of facts. We're in a dangerous place in this nation right now because we can't even agree on a basic set of facts. And that is largely because, I'm not going to get political here, but I think we do have to speak truth. That is largely because we have had a president of the United States, who's still the sitting president for the next 48 hours or so, who has been willing to lie to the American people. And we have had enablers who are willing to amplify those lies. And to be clear, this isn't the spirited back and forth that existed in this country, 2 decades ago about what's the best tax policy, or should we go to war, or should we pass Obamacare. Those are good spirited debates that perfect our union one way or the other. What we're having right now is just a very dark discussion that is devoid of facts. And so I think that is sort of issue number one that I'm seeing. And issue number two is this, and then I'll yield back the floor. There's been a lot of deep-seated racism and anti-Semitism and just bad things that have existed in this country for generations. That tinder existed, before Donald Trump took office. But he's the first, president of the United States, leader of the free world, who was willing to throw a match on that fire and ignite it in a way that has been really destructive in our society, that has threatened to roll back gains on civil rights that we have made, on other types of constitutional rights that we've expanded to people that maybe don't look like me or don't look like a lot of folks who are on this call. That is really dangerous. And that is something that we have to work toward to repair, to put out that fire and to make sure that we can heal, that we can hear one another, and that we can get back to a basic common set of facts so that we can again have that spirited debate that we need to have in this country. That's what Dr. King always preached, was the truth. He tried to advance a movement by speaking truth to people, by getting them to open up their eyes and see others who maybe didn't look like them. And right now in our politics today, I think it's quite difficult for people to do that because of the lies that have been perpetuated across this country.
In Dr. King's last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? It seems like that is particularly prescient because we are at an inflection point where we're going to literally choose whether we're going to be community or chaos. And we got a chance Wednesday before last to see what chaos really looks like. And we know that's not sustainable. The world will laugh at us. Our children will hold us in very low regard. How do you think we build community across racial and ethnic and socioeconomic lines in an America where the match has been thrown on top of the fuel? And is it even possible? Should we give up on this idea that that can even happen because we've seen what we think is a grand failure?
I think it really does start with agreeing on a basic set of facts, holding people accountable who lie, having conversations like this that tend to break down barriers and force people to walk away, seeing someone that maybe doesn't look like them or hearing a perspective that isn't one that they hold, opening up people's eyes. I find that sort of that direct confrontation that people have doesn't need to be a negative confrontation, but that direct confrontation to people and ideas that don't look like them or feel like their ideas is healthy toward helping people grow. I think that is the SCH way. I think it is more of the way than it is not. The problem is a lot of the negative small voices are the ones that are being amplified right now in our society and in our system. And dare I say, it's up to the young people who are on this webinar, Pastor, to sort of take the mantle of leadership and push forward and try to open themselves up and challenge themselves while challenging others at the same time. And it's, I think, with that direct confrontation that we can heal and agree on a basic set of facts again.
Your kids are digital natives. You and I are digital migrants. We didn't start out with this stuff. For us,
Yeah.
digital meant Atari and television, right?
Ooh, I miss the Atari.
I do too. Yeah.
Yeah,
If we tried to play right now, once you cross that 50, the hand-eye coordination is
that's right.
stick to Pac-Man, Josh. The things that we see right now, I think you and I worked in the Congress, our lives have mirrored each other in a remarkably unplanned way. But when you were in the Congress, I was in the Congress as staffers, you had members who disagreed vehemently on the floor. And the second they left the floor, they were friends, they took care of each other, they watched out for each other, they even helped people at a policy level. How much has technology seemed to make people more militant and more extreme? I know you see it because you're dealing with a lot of hate speech, you're dealing with hate crimes. How much is this a byproduct really of just our inability to handle social media and technology, and particularly for our students, because that seems to be where people get radicalized. They usually don't get radicalized sitting at grandma's table. They
Yeah.
get radicalized while they're alone, gaming, and in the world of social media.
Yeah.
How much is this playing a factor?
Big time. And I'll give you my perspective as a dad. I'll give you my perspective as the chief law enforcement officer of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So um, I I don't think that gaming and social media is all bad. I think it can bring people together and amplify messages of healing and goodness and this and that. It also, though, gives people a place where they might feel safe to not just lob insults, but lob threats. I mean, you can imagine the threats that I get day in and day out. You can imagine the anti-Semitic attacks that I get day in and day out. Good news is I don't really even read that stuff anymore. I got folks that read it and monitor it, which is great. But it does give people, I think, a false sense that they can just swing away. And there have been times where I've actually confronted people who have swung away on social media, and boy, do they just back down real quick. And it's largely because they haven't had a conversation where they could have a spirited debate, where they could confront someone that thinks differently than them or looks differently than them. And so I think we got to be careful about being stuck in our social media silos and ignoring the real world. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have the social media, but we got to be careful about that. That's sort of one perspective. And that's the way we try and raise our kids, that a healthy amount, as long as you're still having, normal interpersonal socialization is good. Now, I will tell you, putting my attorney general hat on, we have seen the most violent, despicable, hate-based attacks because of words that are amplified on social media. Look to Western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, Tree of Life. 11 people gunned down in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And the person that did that had been radicalized and sharing his views on Gab, which is a social media outlet for white supremacists. If you look at what is causing us in law enforcement, our federal partners will concur with this, the greatest concern about the security of our homeland, it's not outside forces. It is domestic terrorists who are radicalized online, who are communicating on a lot of the same platforms that you all are communicating on. And I think we have to have an honest discussion in this country about what is the proper level of regulation for that versus, outright freedom for that type of discussion. We all know, of course, you can't scream fire in a crowded theater. So when does this type of information sharing online become screaming fire in a crowded movie theater? And those are the questions that, we in law enforcement and the work I'm doing as your attorney general are trying to answer. It's one of the reasons why I've taken Google and Facebook to court over the way in which they're sharing information and allowing other information to be shared on their platform and restricting others. So these are serious questions that, dare I say, Marshall, you and I probably won't ultimately answer. It'll be the students at SCH who ultimately come up with the answers there. And I think that is one of the greatest challenges of our time, both from how we interact with one another, to start at where you began your question, but also in terms of the direct threats that we face. January 6th, the last thing I'll say, January 6th, let's call this what it was. It was a violent insurrection led by white supremacists on our nation's capital. This wasn't a protest. And I'm sick and tired of people comparing this to some Black Lives Matter protest. You'll excuse my language, Will. That's bullshit. And that's not fair to the righteous people who are peacefully protesting to bring about systematic change in policing and our criminal justice system through the Black Lives Matter movement. What we saw was a violent insurrection coordinated on Twitter, coordinated on Facebook and Signal and many other applications. That's what happened. We've got to be serious about acknowledging that these folks are among us and that they are terrorizing our communities and serious threats. I think we need to be honest, whatever our political perspective is, that this is a danger to all.
My first gig in the Congress was working for Bill Gray. He was the House Majority, he was elected House Majority Whip a month after I arrived. I have, in my mind, I've always taken credit that he would have never been whip unless he hired me as an intern. Just flat out, right?
I think that's true.
Yeah, I'm glad at least, I got a majority of one.
If you look at, hey, Will, if you look at Philadelphia politics and the Philadelphia community today, there are great leaders who all can draw on their family trees line directly back to Bill Gray, and Marshall's one of them.
Absolutely.
I am one of, exactly.
It is, my first gig was in the Capitol, room H114, and I watched in absolute horror as the windows in that office and the windows on the door where I used to enter every day were shattered. And here's what I knew. When I was 19, 20, 21, 22 through 27, everybody knew the Capitol Police were friendly and warm until they were not. And you didn't play games with them. It was very clear what kind of weapons they had to stop cars. They have blockbuster shotguns that stop cars, that blow an engine in half. And it was mortifying for me as someone who grew to respect the US Capitol Police to see that kind of violent insurrection on the people's house to threaten the number 2 and number 3 person in government. And to see those same police officers, I think, jaded by the same kind of racism that we see functioning at a deeper level in society, where if the person who kicked in that door had been Black and 6 feet 2 inches tall and 48 years old and a man, there is no way it would have wound up in a tour of the United States Capitol and sitting in the president of the Senate seat. And so I think that was also an opportunity for America to have the scab ripped off the wound, to say that there is some inequity in policing, and there is inequity in how we respond, all of us, how we respond to the things that white folks do versus Blacks, Hispanics, and I will even lump together poor people, right? When people, I think there's a heavy anti-poor bias in America that cuts across all racial and ethnic groups. But I'll tell you that what happened Wednesday before last is what Black people have been describing in America for 200 years. That when all things being equal, nothing is equal. And that if a Black group, if it had been Black conservatives in MAGA hats exclusively, had they barged into that building that way, it would not have ended the way it ended. And I think if we're going to complete the work, if Sophia and Jonah and your kids are going to complete the work that you and I, Josh, will never live out a chance to see, this country has to have a reckoning around its own bias, and it's got to learn to get real. And it's got to do it. Black folks have got to do it. White folks have got to do it. Latinx have to do it. Asians have to do it. That there is this just original, deep, unyielding sin of racism in this country toward Black people. And I'm not saying everybody's racist, but I know I also harbor some racialized views about who and what Black people are. And I've got to deal with that. And I think this country, if it's ever going to heal from its wounds, it has to have that honest conversation. And those of us who are on all parts of the political continuum, I'm further to the right than you are. You know, I'm a more conservative person ideologically. And I think we've just got to have this honest question if we're going to move on. Otherwise, I think other countries are going to look at that as our Achilles heel, and they're going to prey on us all the time.
You are so right. And this is our original sin. And it manifests itself in policing. You saw that at the Capitol. It manifests itself in our criminal justice system. It manifests itself in our system of education, in our economy. Look at the way whites have amassed wealth over the last 100 years as compared to blacks. It is deep seated in this country. It is embedded in all sectors of our world, and what we need of our world in terms of our community. And I think we need to have some honest conversations about that at places like SCH. I think if you're white, you have a responsibility to learn and to understand, why does that black person say what they say and act the way they act and carry themselves the way they do? Try and understand why they do that. And when you can flip that around, and a black person look at a white person, understand their perspective on things. Until we do that, we're not going to fix our schools. We're not going to fix our economy. We got 50% of people living in poverty in Philadelphia. The vast majority of them are black. That's not just because something happened 5 or 10 years ago. You can draw a straight line to what's happening in the city of Philadelphia and Harrisburg and Reading and Erie and other communities across Pennsylvania to slavery. And until we as white people acknowledge that and recognize that reality, and that we have some responsibility there to address that, then we're not going to solve these bigger systemic problems. We're just not. We've got to be very honest. I try and do that in my work every day. I can control a certain part of the universe, which is our criminal justice system in Pennsylvania. It's why when I took over 4 years ago as the Attorney General, we revamped who's in charge in the office. And so now, Marshall, it's not just people that look like me, it's people that look like you too. We spend considerably less time with our agents, which is like our detectives, the people who are out in the field, focusing on how to shoot a gun and use physical force, and more dealing with the bias that exists between their ears and the mental health aspects of their positions, so that we don't make some of the same mistakes that are made in other law enforcement agencies. Confronting that directly, acknowledging that bias exists, acknowledging that work needs to be done, putting people in place that are more diverse, those are all important steps in a long journey we're going to have to engage in to repair the world and to do our part to create more equality in our system.
The one thing that bedevils, at least from my perspective, the whole conversation around equality in America, and I think African-American politicians, I've said this to you, have done just a very lousy job of creating economic opportunity. And I don't mean government programs.
Right.
I mean really using the power of public policy to grow the American pie. Because I do think some of the people who are far-right nationalists are responding because they have fear that their America is going away and a privileged place is being compromised. I mean, I hear this language about communist. I mean, this is, that's what I used to do to people when I was 14 and I was on the right, and I'd call somebody I disagree. Oh, you're a communist. That's why you agree with that. Right? You're a commie, right? And I think until we take an honest look at Philadelphia. 2.3%, 46%, 45% Black, but only 2.3% of the businesses that do business with the city of Philadelphia are Black. There is no way to accomplish or achieve Dr. King's dream if it is just social justice, pause on January 15th, spend a little more time during February, and then go back to business as usual. And from my perspective, the African-American community has to get much more serious about making sure that it has an equity position in America. Because the irony is the communists in China now represent the world's largest holding company, which is the Communist Party in China. Even the communists have become capitalist. And I think that that has to be something that the Black community has to address, because nothing equalizes things more than money and access to capital. And I think we've got to be, on left and right, we've got to be a lot more honest about these economic issues and realize, I think we'll get to the finish line a lot faster if we pay more attention to dollars and cents as well.
Couldn't agree with you more. That access to capital, that's going to bring about the greatest equity. It's going to repair our schools. It's going to alleviate poverty, and it's going to force the uncomfortable discussions that we must have on our criminal justice system, for example. That's going to bring about greater equality, because more people will have a stake in this system and have a voice in this system. That really matters.
Before we go, and I've not gotten any cues yet, I just want you to know how much your children inspire me. I've gotten to know Sophia better at a professional level. She's in college, and I talked to her a lot this fall around things that she cares about deeply and passionately. And I found myself wanting to talk to her more and getting an education from her. In my community, we say, good trees produce good fruit, and she's good fruit. And it's because she comes from you and Laurie and the rest of your family. So you've done a great job. And I think the whole idea of getting to where we are going to go and where we have to go is that it has to be legacy relationships where kids look back and say, you know what, that wasn't tolerated in my house. It's not going to be tolerated in my relationships. And I think that's how we move the ball down the field.
I appreciate that, and I'm so darn proud of my kids. And Soph is an amazing young woman she's going to do something in life, man. And we're all going to be better. We're all going to be better for it. But I want to just touch really quickly on the word relationships. No movement, no major change happens unless you have real relationships that break down barriers. And you and I have talked about Dr. Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel. The relationship between Jews and Blacks, different types of relationships like that break down barriers and force people to come together to solve problems is what we need. And in a great diverse city like Philadelphia, with the big brains that you have at a school like SCH, by the way, 2 of my cousins went there and they're better off for going there. It is a big deal to put these big brains to use in a great city like this, to create those relationships that are going to address some of these serious challenges that we face. And if you look to history, you can read in some of these books behind me, it is those relationships that ultimately yielded changes in our communities, brought about new laws, and opened people's eyes up to change. Look at the work that LBJ did to bring about the Civil Rights Act. He was not exactly a guy, if you looked at on paper, or really looked at in his legislative work leading up to that you would think would necessarily ultimately be the champion of this. But he was, and a lot of that is because of the relationships, some forced, some natural, that he had, that opened up his eyes and put him in a position where he was willing to make those changes in law. Legal changes aren't all we need. Again, it goes back to what we said before, breaking down the barriers, the stereotypes, the lack of understanding. It's going to require people coming together from different walks of life to bring about those relationships and that change.
And I couldn't imagine having all Black friends and how boring that world would be.
Yeah.
It just, talking to yourself at some point becomes monotonous, right? And so finding people who are different, that's been our strength as a country, even when we were not a more perfect union yet. It's been talking to other people who are in different places, ideologically, religiously, ethnically, in terms of their orientation, and learning from them and building that beloved community. And so I'm inspired by the students at SCH, what Dr. Druggin's doing there, and my friendship with you.
You too, my friend.
So that was excellent. We have a few questions.
Is it better than Cory Booker? I think.
Yeah. Hey, Judge, I represent the senator, so I think it was a tie. But so a couple of questions from of our audience members.
Sure.
One is MLK's principles were rooted in equity and equality. What can young students and young people do to continue his legacy to ensure equity for all?
Go ahead and take a shot at that, Josh.
Go ahead. Did you want to go?
No, you go. You go. I'm older than you are.
Now look, I mean, it's what we've been talking about here today. That equity and the policy changes, the financial changes, the educational and legal changes, they don't come from top down. We've seen how broken huge chunks of government are. They're going to come from bottom up. And when I look at the biggest issues that we face today that are going to require some governmental action, I see them in no particular order as follows. The existential threat of climate change, the threat that comes from racism and the need for greater equality and expanding civil rights. I see it also when it comes to gun violence. And so when you look at those three things, the solutions aren't coming from the Congress of the United States or the legislature of Pennsylvania. In fact, a lot of the people in charge are slowing down progress on those things. Where I'm seeing the most dramatic change come that's pushing people along in this is from young people, is from a lot of voices who aren't even old enough to vote yet, probably many who are on this webinar here today. And so I think young people need to continue to make noise. I think they need to continue to engage and then ultimately vote. And if you look at this past election, whether you're for Joe Biden or not, whether you're for Ossoff or Warnock in Georgia or not, whether you were for me or not, big parts of our victories are due to young, diverse populations showing up and voting. And ultimately, when someone like me gets returned to Harrisburg, by the way, with more votes than anyone in the history of Pennsylvania, thanks to the strength of that diverse coalition. I hear that diverse coalition when I do my work every day. And so to me, young people organizing, particularly around those few issues where I think real leadership is needed, is ultimately going to yield better elected representatives who are accountable to them, and hopefully some who will bring about real change.
I'm going to re-echo Josh and say there's no advantage greater than youth. You come at problems in a fresh new way. You aren't jaded by things you've already seen. And so every single time I talk to somebody who's 15 or 16, 17, it's a whole new education for me. So I do it all the time. And so the two places I always go as I'm making moves is I talk to very young people and I talk to very old people, because very old people have seen every play before and a lot of young people have not seen any plays. And so they're not bringing any inherent fear of trying something different. And so every single time, your advantage is being young, continue to exercise and play to your strengths.
Great. Another question is from an SCH teacher. How would you recommend that I foster conversation and growth in this movement? From an SCH teacher.
Look, I'm a big believer in putting students in an uncomfortable position where they're forced to confront things that aren't sort of typical for them or might cut against maybe some of the things that aren't helpful that they're hearing at home or heard in their neighborhoods. Put them in that situation, create the opportunity for dialogue, and get the hell out of the way and just let students talk. Some of the most inspiring conversations I've had all across Pennsylvania, and I've been to each of Pennsylvania's 67 counties multiple times, during my tenure in office, is showing up at schools and letting students talk about the challenges that they face, about the racism that they experience, the homophobia that they experience, the anti-Semitism they experience, and then talking openly about it and how they're trying to change it and creating the opportunity for uncomfortable dialogue that yields some tolerance. So look, the fact that SCH is willing to have Marshall and I talk about these issues here tonight, demonstrates the kind of institution that you are, that you care about these issues. And I would just say, whether you're in science class, math class, or social studies, there should be an opportunity for students to engage in meaningful dialogue that kind of pushes the boundaries on some of their belief systems and forces them to confront things that maybe aren't the typical things that they would think growing up in the environments that they are.
Exchange dinner invitations. Remarkable things happen when people sit down and talk and exchange ideas in places where you are initially uncomfortable, and then you realize there's so much commonality. And so if you're at an environment like SCH, which is an elite prep school, uh, if the only Black kids you get to know are the Black kids who are on the basketball team who you cheer for, you're cheating yourself out of a great education. Try to figure out a way to become friends with people, go to their homes, and break down those barriers. And don't let meaningless things like how much you have versus how little someone else has, or vice versa, stop you from getting to know what's in that person's head. And I think when America begins to cross pollinate, that's again the beauty of a place like SCH. You've got people from all over the region. And if you start to cross pollinate, you're going to create things that you've never even thought of.
Great. Two more questions, and then y'all both are off the hot seat for this evening. If you could, this is from Dr. Drugan, if you could wave a wand and change anything to improve the gun laws or and decrease the gun violence in our city, what would you do?
Man, do you have an hour? Because I can talk in great depth about this. I'll try and be very brief. First, on the laws, we absolutely need to have universal background checks. There is no reason why you should be able to buy a gun anywhere without going through a background check. And for those who support the Second Amendment, and I do, there is no excuse and no reason to rely on the Second Amendment as a crutch, while also saying that somehow it's okay for criminals to get their hands on guns. That makes us all less safe. I track crime guns here in the Commonwealth, and I will tell you that there are too many people getting their hands on these crime guns and too many people getting guns who are prohibited purchasers. We need universal background checks. We need to eliminate weapons of war on our streets. We need to get rid of ghost guns, which are a massive threat. If you don't know what ghost guns are, these are basically guns that you can buy in two parts. Sometimes they're called 80% receivers. They get clipped together. You got a working gun, but when you go and buy it in two parts, you don't have to go through a background check. I've written in a legal opinion here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that they ought to be treated like guns and go through background checks. Those are the laws that need to change. We also need to continue, and I started something called Track and Trace as your Attorney General, to track every crime gun, which helps us not just solve crime, but trying to anticipate where crime is going to occur. We also have to be very honest with ourselves about the fact that a very small percentage of the population is committing a large amount of crime with guns. And so when you look at that, you have to ask yourself, why is it that these people who are committing these horrific crimes are allowed to be out on the street? An article in the Inquirer today about just that. I think our bail laws, and by the way, I've reformed bail. We no longer will issue bail or ask for bail in cases where folks are nonviolent or where they're poor or what have you, just to keep behind bars. But we will do it when they're violent. We will do it as a means to keep the community safe. Yet too often times, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, someone who should never be allowed out on the street is writing $1,000 or $2,000 check covering bail going out. And as is the case of the individual who was walking his dog just the other day, I believe he's a Temple student, was shot by someone who absolutely should not have been on the street. When you look at the gun violence that's occurring each night in the city of Philadelphia, the next morning, when you look at the information, as I do, 85% of those individuals are out on bail when they shouldn't be. That is a serious, serious problem in our system that needs to be addressed. So we need to change our gun laws. We need to address how bail is working. We need to continue to track these crime guns and the way gun trafficking goes. My arrests and seizures for gun trafficking are up more than 50% over the last 4 years in office. We take that very, very seriously. Beyond that, there are obviously systemic issues that need to be addressed. And you have to ask yourself, why someone picking up a gun in the first place? I don't think that was the nature of the question. You were asking me more about the laws, but I will say equally important is dealing with things like educational opportunities and poverty, and dealing with the question as to why does someone try and sell drugs in the first place and feel as though they need a gun for safety in their neighborhood. When we address questions like that, we will also have to confront some of the racial issues that we've been talking about here today, and yield a safer community by virtue of that work. So I think in part it's those public policy changes and dealing with confronting these these age-old questions, and in part it's really revamping our gun laws and getting more serious about bail, particularly in the city of Philadelphia.
Well, this guy, Josh Shapiro's got a future in politics. I don't care what anybody says.
I think he does too. I think he does too.
There isn't anybody any better on these issues. And he stole my line by saying, anybody who's got an online interview tomorrow with Google is not going to shoot anybody tonight because they've got too much to live for, right? And I think we've got to get to the place where we create an opportunity society where opportunities are coming to people, opportunities are available to people. And it starts in vitro, it starts in utero. It starts before somebody is born. And I think as we create a better society where people see themselves having a stake, they're not likely to pick up a gun. They're not going to rob anybody. They're going to be inside tonight. They're going to be outside enjoying a restaurant. And I think the more and better we do at creating that opportunity, the less we're going to have to even worry about the Second Amendment.
Excellent. And last question for the evening is, we're a more diverse and tolerant country than ever before, yet we're still experiencing a rise in white supremacy activity. Do you see this as evidence that we're further away from realizing Dr. King's vision than we think, or is it the last gasp of dying ideology?
I think it is the last gasp. The wounded tiger fights a little bit differently. I think people have seen this rising tide of Black folks, gay folks, people who are not religious at all, and I think that has frightened people. And so I do think we will realize it. I don't know if we'll realize the totality of Dr. King's dream in my lifetime. And maybe it's such a thing that you never actually get to it, that it's always evolutionary, that there's always work to be done. I don't know that we're more tolerant now than we've ever been. I'm not convinced of that. I felt a little bit differently in the 1980s and maybe early 1990s, and I might be nostalgic, but I felt like there was more inevitability in those days that we would reach some of these goals. And I no longer think it's inevitable. When I see in 2021, people walking around the United States Capitol with a shirt emblazoned with Camp Auschwitz, and then I see someone else carrying a Confederate flag, flags that never made their way to that building during the Civil War, I'm not certain that we're more tolerant. And so I think it's also a battle cry for those of us who want to be on the right and moral and good side of history, to fight like we've never fought before, to fight like we have no intention to surrender to people, and to stand up to the forces of evil with a muscularity that we've not stood up with our lifetime. And I don't consider it to be inevitable. I don't know that we're any more tolerant. I grew up in a household, in a community that was remarkably tolerant and remarkably diverse. And if Miss Primavera, who was our next door neighbor, told us to do something, we didn't say, well, you're Italian, you can't tell me what to do because I'm Black. And just like Lillian Beck, who was right down the street, she was like a Jewish grandmother to me. If she saw me do something, I would rather die than go home and see my parents. And so I think we've got to return also to that sense, because for me, they were intolerant, and they were intolerant of anybody who lived in their community. or who they were charged with helping to shape. They didn't tolerate anything that was less than your best.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess I would say, look, by any objective measure, we've made significant progress when we think about where we stand today in 2020 than where we stood in 1950, right? I mean, our laws have changed, our schools have changed, our economy has changed. It doesn't, though, necessarily, it certainly doesn't mean that we're done. And for all the reasons we've been talking, we've got a lot more work to do. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're more tolerant just because some of those laws have changed. The tolerance is something that's, baked in each of us. I'd like to think that we're better off. But I think that it is clear that we have a ways to go. In some ways, the election and service of Barack Obama as president of the United States helped mask a lot of that intolerance that existed in that, that tinder that I talked about before. A lot of people say, well, we have a black president. We can't be all that bad. We can't be all that racist. We can't be all that, sort of backward in our thinking. And in some ways, the election of Donald Trump has maybe over amplified it because, of course, as I said before, he was willing to light the match to that tinder. I just don't believe, I refuse to believe that what went into the Capitol in that violent way, as Marshall was talking about before, that's not who we are. That's a segment of our population that we need to confront and be honest about and acknowledge that it exists. But I don't think that represents, generally speaking, who we are. So we've made a lot of progress. We got a hell of a lot of work to do. The tolerance piece of this is what's really in your hands. You can change laws indirectly by virtue of organizing and helping elect people and holding them accountable. That takes time. But what you can do in the immediate short term is change attitudes and minds and that level of tolerance that we so desperately need in our communities today.
Josh, I think we've got to also do something. We've got to redefine what being patriotic means. You don't get to call yourself a patriot because you watch one news channel.
Yeah.
And you like when somebody plays Lee Greenwood's song and you cry because you're proud to be an American, where at least you're free. That's not what a patriot is.
Correct.
That's called marketing. And I think for me, patriotic looks like kids who can't even vote yet, but demand that America realize the fullness of her potential.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think we have also made a mistake of letting people who simply wave flags and have conflated a cross, a gun, and a flag into one thing that ultimately leads to the creation of Jesus, who looks like a white guy and fights my battles, right? And that's what people have allowed. Instead, patriotism has to look and sound like something very, very different. And you don't have the right to call yourself a patriot when you're doing absolutely nothing that makes this country better. And I think we also need to call out people, because everybody, I'm a patriot. No, you're not a patriot. You're a punk. I shouldn't use that language on SCH, but.
Amen. And by the way, you're not just a punk, you're an insurrectionist who's about to get arrested for serious crimes. If you carry the flag and call yourself a patriot while at the same time breaking windows and hunting for Nancy Pelosi in the Capitol of the United States, that is not patriotism. And I couldn't agree with you more, Marshall. That is an incredibly important point. Those who seek to, corner the market on patriotism, they tend to be the ones who are the least patriotic among us.
Yeah, they've never fought for anything.
Last thing I want to say on that, because you bring up such a great point. I know Will's trying to end this, but here's the thing.
No.
This is what I want to say. Just because You march for change because you think our city, our commonwealth, our country can be more fair and just. And just because you might not look like the people who have been running our government for the last century doesn't make you any less patriotic. In some ways, it makes you more because you're doing the hard work to perfect our union.
Right.
So I think it is incredibly important that we not allow people to define patriotism on their term, but rather on the terms that we can all universally understand, which is that we're all rowing in a direction of common good and trying to bring about real change in this nation that's going to help others.
Will, I know Will's trying to cut us off, but he's in this terrible place where he is fighting against the forces of doom.
Josh, I have one. I have a good one. We're getting questions about, Marshall, you getting back into politics because someone said you're the kind of leader that we need. So I figured you would like to tell us what office you were going to be running for. I'm sure Josh and I both, knowing you are in close friends, would love to hear that.
I would love to hear the answer to that question.
Absolutely none. Despite the pressure of many dear friends, none. Let me say this. I think the leverage that I exercise as the pastor of a church with growing significance and being a moral force to keep elected officials honest on left and right is something that I couldn't have in elected office. My ship has already sailed with respect to that. You guys, you two guys know my passions as well as anybody on the planet. And I think it's storytelling, it's building African-American institutions that perform in measurable ways differently and being unapologetic about it. And in that way, I'm a class of 1 or 2 maybe. And so that's where my heart is. I was gonna say, dovetailing with what Josh, during the Black Lives Matter stuff, and during this pandemic, I have been very active with Abington Police Department. Chief Pat Malloy is a close friend of mine. We talk often, and the police officers on that force are my friends, and we have a police athletic league site at our church. And I hosted those ladies and men at the apogee and peak of the George Floyd stuff because I wanted to remind those police officers, number one, I care about them. Number two, 98, 99% of police officers I regard as very good people and law abiding. It's probably, you probably have exactly the same rate of bad cops that you have bad pastors. Let's say it that way, right? I won't even quantify it.
And bad politics.
And bad politicians, right? And bad consultants and bad US senators. But I said to that group of people who were gathered that because I love you and care about you, I also have to hold you accountable. And I know you can do more. It struck me, Josh, as you were talking about people who arrogate to themselves this unblemished patriotism, to see those people beating United States Capitol Police officers with flagpoles that used to hold Old Glory. It said to me, you know what? These people never really loved police. What they loved is the perception of what police do to Black people. And that's a very big difference because they went to the Capitol that day. That mindset was, we love the blue, we back the blue because the blue doesn't take no stuff from the Black folks, right? And you saw that in their interactions because they were willing to do anything to those police officers. And it's remarkable the restraint that those police officers exercised because the entire thing could have been a totally different conflagration.
Couldn't agree with you more. And 2 police officers are dead because these guys who proclaimed to back the blue staged a violent insurrection in the Capitol. And again, I agree with everything you said. I'd also point out for the record, Will, he didn't really answer your question and
he did not.
He wouldn't run.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, listen, I appreciate both of you very much. And,
You guys don't play
and
fair,
our
man.
and our community thanks you. And Josh and Marshall, we would love to have you back again sometime soon. So with that, we'll bid farewell to everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hey, listen, everybody, just stay safe and stay healthy. Wear your masks. You know, we got a little bit more to go here until everybody gets their vaccines in their arms. I just wish you all good health and safety and peace as our country moves forward here. And on a personal note, I'm going to be sworn into my second term tomorrow as your Attorney General, and it's the honor of my lifetime to be your lawyer. And I just want to say thank you to everybody for letting me serve the public in the way that I do. Thank you, Will. Thanks, Marshall.
And we wish you all the
Josh,
best
Will.
in your next term too.
Congratulations, brother. I'll see you tomorrow.
Congratulations.